Hello. Before we begin, I want to explain what this is. What you are about to hear is a true account, told by someone who works in emergency response. If you are listening right now, you are welcome to leave a short comment about where you are listening from. This account is shared exactly as it was recorded. Nothing has been added or dressed up. It is based on work records, personal memory, and the effects that are still felt today. This is not meant to scare you. It is simply a statement. This is where the confession begins. My name is Aaron Cole. I am a senior field coordinator for a regional emergency communications authority. I have served for 19 years. My jurisdiction covers a multi-county high desert corridor that includes state highways, utility right-of-ways, repeater towers, and unincorporated settlements that do not appear on most maps. We provide dispatch support and field coordination for law enforcement, fire, medical, and infrastructure crews when incidents cross agency boundaries. It is a quiet job until it is not. Most of my work happens at night. That is not by policy. It is by necessity. Night is when coverage gaps show themselves. Night is when people get lost between jurisdictions. Night is when the rules matter. The first rule I was taught was never written down. It was told to me by my predecessor during a tower inspection outside a decommissioned mining town. He said if you hear your name over an open channel and no unit identifier comes before it, you do not answer. You log it as interference. You move on. I laughed at the time. He did not. The environment out here is flat until it suddenly is not. Dry basins cut by old flood paths. Long sightlines that make you feel less alone than you are. At night, the wind carries sound in ways that do not make sense. Radios pick up distant traffic from other states. Sometimes voices bleed through that do not belong to anyone logged in the system. We call those ghosts in training. Not officially. Officially, they are classified as anomalous signal events. We are told not to personalize them. Within my first year, I learned that rules existed long before I arrived. They were inherited. They were passed verbally. They were enforced by consequence. In my third month on solo rotation, a contract line worker named Miguel Herrera failed to return from a routine fiber check near mile marker 47. This was in the year 2008. The location was a wash north of Red Basin Road. Miguel was not one of ours, but we coordinated the response. Search teams found his truck with the doors open and the radio still on. His last transmission was calm. He said, "Dispatch, I have eyes on someone walking out here. They look lost. I am going to check on them." That transmission violated a rule I did not know yet. You do not approach pedestrians at night outside jurisdiction. Compassion is not coverage. Miguel was never found. His boots were located 6 months later, placed neatly beside the road. No tracks leading to or from them. That was my first loss. I did not know him well. I knew his voice. I am telling you this now because inevitability needs context. We did not stop this thing. We learned how to keep it from spreading. The entity does not present itself all at once. At first, it is procedural noise, missed check-ins, duplicate call signs, a voice that sounds tired and asks for help using the right words but the wrong timing. It exploits our training. It waits for us to care. There are 5 primary rules. They are not written together. They are learned separately. The second rule is that you never send a single unit to a voice report without visual confirmation from infrastructure cameras or a second agency. That rule exists because the entity can only engage when we create isolation. Its limitation is that it cannot initiate contact without being acknowledged by an authorized responder. It needs permission. It needs a response. I did not know that then. In the year 2011, I was promoted to night coordinator. I took over the desk with the cracked console and the old analog backup radio that no one wanted to service anymore. The previous coordinator retired early. No reason given. He shook my hand. and told me to trust the quiet more than the noise. That same year, my sister Emily moved into my house after a separation. She had a 6-year-old son. I took night shifts so I could be home during the day. That mattered later. The first time the entity used a familiar voice was during a storm outage near the northern relay. A call came in on the backup channel. No identifier, just my name spoken the way my sister says it, when she is worried. I froze. I did not answer. I logged interference. The storm passed. The outage resolved. I went home shaking. I did not tell anyone. That was my mistake. Rules are supposed to protect the system. Silence protects the entity. 2 years later, a deputy named Lauren Pike disappeared after responding to a stranded motorist call that did not exist. This was in the year 2013, near Coyote Flats. She broke the third rule: never follow a voice off-road. Her cruiser was found idling with the lights off. Her body was never recovered. Her radio was discovered weeks later transmitting nothing but breathing. We adjusted procedures, added layers, required confirmations. It slowed response times. People complained. Administrators reassured us that incidents were down. That was the false stabilization. The entity adapted by waiting longer. By the time I understood the pattern, it had learned our names, our schedules, our attachments. It used recorded traffic. It mimicked dispatch protocols. It did not rush. It let us make the choice. I am not telling you this to scare you. I am telling you because if you work in these systems, you already feel it. The hesitation before answering a call. The weight of deciding whether a voice deserves help. At the end of my 5th year, I received a call that changed how I hear everything. It came from my nephew. Or, it sounded like him. He said, "Uncle Aaron, Mom is not waking up." The channel was wrong. The timestamp was wrong. I followed the rule. I did not answer. I called home on my personal phone. My sister was asleep. My nephew was asleep. No one had spoken. That night I understood that the entity does not need to take bodies to cause loss. It can take certainty. I began documenting everything. Off the books. Voice prints. Timing anomalies. Patterns of who it targeted. Always people who would respond. Never people who would hesitate. There was one more rule I learned too late. If you think the voice is someone you love, you are already compromised. I am still at the desk. I still coordinate. I still delay. Containment is not heroic. It is exhausting. And it is temporary. This is the beginning of the account. It gets worse from here. I did not file an incident report after the call that sounded like my nephew. I logged it as atmospheric interference and moved on. That is how normalization begins. Not denial. Accommodation. You tell yourself the rule worked. You tell yourself the system held. You do not tell anyone how close you came to answering. After that night, I stopped trusting my own instincts. I relied on procedure even when it felt wrong. Especially when it felt wrong. That is how the entity prefers it. It pushes you toward extremes. Either reckless compassion or rigid obedience. Both create openings. Within the next year, anomalies increased in frequency but decreased in intensity. Short voice bursts. Partial identifiers. Requests that stopped just short of urgency. We called it chatter fatigue. Supervisors treated it as a morale issue. They brought in consultants who recommended shorter shifts and wellness check-ins. No one addressed the pattern. The pattern was this. The entity was mapping escalation thresholds. It was learning how much pressure each role could take before breaking a rule. Dispatchers broke first. They are trained to help voices. Field units broke second. They are trained to act. Coordinators like me broke last. We are trained to delay. In the spring of the year 2014, a wildfire burned through the eastern edge of my jurisdiction. It was not a large fire by state standards, but it crossed enough boundaries to activate Joint Command. We set up a mobile operations trailer near an abandoned rest area. Power was spotty. Radios were overloaded. It was the kind of environment where rules blur. That was where I lost Mark Delaney. Mark was a communications tech. He had worked with me for 8 years. We trusted each other. He knew the unwritten rules. He helped write some of them. During the second night of operations, a Mayday call came in on a fire channel that had been reassigned. The voice used Mark's name. It said there was a crew trapped beyond the containment line. The location matched a gap in our map coverage. Mark looked at me. He said we need to verify. I told him to wait. I told him we needed visual confirmation. He said the fire does not wait. He was right. That was the misleading rule. Sometimes delay causes harm. Sometimes waiting is the violation. Mark took a handheld radio and stepped outside the trailer to get a clearer signal. That broke the isolation rule. He was gone for less than a minute. I followed him out and found the radio on the ground, still transmitting. The fire never reached that spot. Mark never came back. Command ruled it a line of duty loss due to environmental conditions. His family received honors. No one asked why there were no burn injuries. No one asked why his boots were found facing inward toward the trailer. After Mark, I stopped believing we could balance the rules. They were not a system. They were a sieve. Administration implemented a new protocol after the fire. All anomalous voice events were to be routed through a centralized filter before reaching field units. It was called the Quiet Channel Initiative. It reduced incidents on paper. It also gave the entity a new bottleneck to exploit. I became that bottleneck. Every night I listened to voices that wanted help. Some were real, some were not. The entity learned to blend. It would let real emergencies through unchanged, so that trust in the channel remained. Then it would insert itself just enough to force a choice. The fourth rule is that you never respond emotionally to a call. You acknowledge. You verify. You defer. That rule exists because emotion accelerates decision-making. The entity feeds on speed. In the year 2016, my sister Emily was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition. It was manageable but unpredictable. She was afraid. I was tired. I took on more shifts to keep insurance coverage stable. I told myself it was temporary. One night during a routine infrastructure patrol, a call came in from a water treatment facility at the edge of the basin. The operator reported a man inside the restricted intake area. He was unresponsive, but breathing. The facility was understaffed. They requested immediate law enforcement. I checked the cameras. The feed was distorted. The man on the ground looked like my father. My father had been dead for 10 years. I felt the rule breaking inside me before I acted. I dispatched a single unit. I violated the second rule knowingly. I told myself it was different. I told myself this was not a voice. The responding officer was a rookie named James Holloway. He arrived on scene and reported visual on the subject. He said, "Dispatch, I think he is hurt. He sounds confused. He is calling my name." I ordered him to withdraw. He hesitated. He said, "Sir, he says he is cold." That was compassion. James crossed the intake barrier. The camera feed went dark. We found James's cruiser at shift change. Doors open. Engine cold. No sign of struggle. His body was recovered 2 days later downstream. Cause of death listed as drowning. No water in his lungs. That night I went home and sat in the dark until morning. My nephew woke up and asked me why I was crying. I told him I was tired. After James, the entity escalated. Not in violence, in familiarity. It began using administrative language. It referenced policies. It cited names of supervisors. It filed requests. We received an email one morning from an internal address that no longer existed. It requested clarification on response delays for anomalous events. It was written in perfect bureaucratic tone. That was when I realized the entity was not just listening. It was studying. The fifth rule is the most dangerous. You do not update the rules in response to an incident. Changes must be slow. Reactive adaptation creates gaps. That rule exists because the entity anticipates our fear. Administration ignored that rule. They demanded solutions. They demanded metrics. We added checklists. We added confirmations. Each addition created new edges. In the winter of the year 2018, incidents dropped to near zero. We called it a success. Quiet channel reports decreased. Field losses stopped. I allowed myself to breathe. That was the false stabilization fully realized. During that winter, my sister had a relapse. She collapsed at home while I was on shift. My nephew called emergency services. The call routed through my center. I recognized his voice. It was real. I answered. I broke every rule without hesitation. Response was delayed because of weather. She survived. Barely. I sat by her hospital bed and promised her I would take time off. I did not. The entity waited. In the spring, calls resumed. Not more frequent, more precise. It began targeting administrators, middle managers, people who believed they were insulated by distance. A deputy director answered a call directly and vanished from a parking garage. A regional supervisor followed a voice into a stairwell and never came out. Containment failed quietly. I requested a transfer. It was denied. I was considered essential. Institutional erosion looks like that. You become indispensable because you have absorbed the damage. I started sleeping at the office. I stopped going home at night. My sister noticed. She asked me if something was wrong. I told her I was just busy. The entity used her voice again 3 weeks later. This time it asked me to come home. It said she was scared. I did not answer. I shut down the channel. I sat in silence for 6 hours. When I finally went home, the house was empty. My sister had taken my nephew and left. She said she could not live with my distance. That was my third loss, caused by duty or by fear. The difference matters less than you think. The entity cannot force you to answer. It cannot cross a boundary uninvited. Its limitation remains, but it is patient. It knows we will eventually invite it in. We always do. After my sister left, the house stopped being a place I could measure time. I slept there during daylight hours only. At night I stayed at the operations center or drove the perimeter roads until dawn. Distance became another rule. If I stayed away from people long enough, I could not be used against them. That was the logic. It was flawed. Administratively, the center was under review. The disappearances of supervisors could not be hidden anymore. Officially, they were medical events, resignations, unexplained absences. Unofficially, everyone knew something was wrong. No one could agree on what. I was asked to brief an oversight committee in the summer of the year 2019. They wanted anomalies explained without panic. They wanted assurance. I gave them charts. I showed them reduced incident counts. I did not tell them how the entity had learned to work around metrics. Silence is easier when it looks like success. After the briefing, a junior analyst named Priya followed me into the hallway. She asked me why the voice samples all ended just before escalation. She asked me why the timestamps clustered around emotional stressors. She was sharp. She cared. That made her vulnerable. 2 weeks later, she answered a call routed to the quiet channel during a staffing gap. The voice asked her to verify a policy change. It sounded like her mentor. She stepped into a side office to pull records. The camera feed showed her nodding, then listening, then leaving the frame. She never came back. Her disappearance forced a procedural freeze. External investigators arrived. They were polite. They were thorough. They asked for logs. They asked for recordings. I provided everything that would not expose the rules. That is how complicity works. You tell yourself you are protecting people by withholding truth. You are actually protecting the threat. During the freeze, response times increased. Field units complained. Emergency calls stacked. The entity exploited the backlog by inserting itself into legitimate traffic. It did not rush. It allowed small failures to cascade. One night, a volunteer search and rescue team requested coordination for a missing hiker. The call was clean. The coordinates were real. I authorized deployment. Halfway through the operation, a second call came in from the same hiker, using the same identifier, but a different voice. It said they were injured and could not wait. The teams argued over which signal to follow. That conflict cost time. The hiker was found alive, but hypothermic. The delay nearly killed him. The entity did not need to take him. It only needed to prove control. I began keeping a private ledger, not of incidents, of decisions. Every time I hesitated, every time I chose one rule over another, patterns emerged. The entity targeted moments of moral ambiguity. It spoke when there was no right answer. The sixth rule was one no one admitted existed. You never admit uncertainty to subordinates. Authority depends on confidence. The entity uses doubt as an opening. By the end of that year, I was operating on exhaustion alone. My voice on recordings sounded flat. I stopped correcting people when they broke minor procedures. Enforcement slipped. The system frayed. During a routine audit, an external contractor flagged irregular data packets leaving our network. They were not large. They were not frequent. They mimicked automated backups. The destination addresses did not resolve. We shut down outbound traffic. The entity responded by going analog. It began using payphones. Calls came in routed through legacy lines that should not have existed anymore. The voices were clearer, less distorted. They referenced personal details that were not in any database. Childhood nicknames, old injuries, regrets. One call used my mother's voice. She died when I was young. The call asked me why I never visited. I logged interference. My hands shook for an hour. We implemented a mandatory two-person verification for all legacy line calls. That helped until it did not. The entity waited until staffing was thin. In early spring of the year 2020, a regional blackout hit the southern corridor. Infrastructure crews were dispatched to restore power. Communications were degraded. The environment was perfect. A crew lead named Samira Khan called in reporting a trapped worker at a substation. The voice in the background was crying. It sounded like a child. That broke the seventh rule. You do not respond to juvenile voices over industrial channels. Children do not belong there. Samira requested permission to enter a restricted area, alone to reach the voice. I denied it. She argued. She said she could not leave a child. I told her there was no child. She told me I was wrong. She went anyway. The blackout ended hours later. The substation was intact. There was no sign of a child. Samira was found sitting against a transformer. Alive. Unresponsive. She would not speak again. Doctors said it was psychological. I knew better. The entity had learned it could take more than bodies. It could hollow people out. That incident forced a regional shutdown. We lost coverage. Neighboring jurisdictions filled gaps without knowing the rules. Incidents spiked there instead. The entity spread. That was the first time I understood the scale. It was not local. It was opportunistic. I requested authorization to disseminate the rules beyond our center. I was denied. The justification was panic risk. The real reason was liability. Institutions protect themselves before they protect people. At home, my sister stopped returning my messages. My nephew stopped answering calls. I could not blame them. Distance had become abandonment. The entity used that. One night, during a lull, a call came in on my personal phone. It was my nephew. He said he was lost. He said he could not find his mother. The call metadata showed it originated from a location outside any coverage area. I knew the rule. I knew the limitation. It needed my response. I turned the phone off. The next morning, my sister called from a hospital. My nephew had wandered away from school. He was found unharmed. He did not remember calling me. That was when I understood that the entity could create consequences even when denied. It punished restraint, as well as compassion. I began to see no safe choices. That is how erosion becomes collapse. During the summer, an internal memo circulated announcing a restructuring. The Quiet Channel initiative would be expanded statewide. I was to lead training. I was to teach the rules without explaining why they existed. That was the final institutional failure. We were about to scale ignorance. I refused. I submitted my resignation. It was not accepted. Instead, I was placed on administrative leave pending evaluation. My access was restricted. I was told to rest. I was told to recover. The entity did not need my access anymore. It had enough others. On my last night in the building, before my badge deactivated, I stayed late. I listened. The channels were quiet. Too quiet. Then a voice came through on the backup radio. No identifier. It said, "Thank you for teaching us patience." I did not respond. I shut the system down. I walked out into the night knowing containment had shifted. Administrative leave did not mean separation. It meant observation. My badge no longer opened doors, but my name still opened conversations. Supervisors called to ask questions they could not put in emails. Dispatchers sent messages from personal phones, asking if a call felt wrong. I answered carefully. I avoided rules. I described patterns instead. Distance did not protect me. It made me porous. 2 weeks into leave, an internal incident occurred without me present. A night shift dispatcher acknowledged a voice without realizing it lacked an identifier. The voice requested confirmation of a mutual aid response near the Western Aqueduct. The dispatcher followed procedure. They deferred. They verified. They escalated. Every step was correct. That was the harm. Each confirmation fed the entity. By the time a field unit arrived, 3 agencies had acknowledged the call. Isolation was complete. The unit disappeared. Not physically. The vehicle was recovered. The officers were found hours later wandering separate stretches of highway. Alive. Oriented. Unable to explain where they had been. They remembered following instructions. They remembered helping someone. They remembered nothing else. Medical evaluations showed no injury. Psych evaluations showed fragmentation. They could not be returned to duty. That was when administration realized disappearance was not the only metric that mattered. I was asked to consult unofficially. No paperwork. No recording. Just a conversation in a closed office with a deputy director who looked older than I remembered. He asked me if the rules could be tightened. I told him tightening would accelerate failure. He asked me what I would do. I told him I would slow everything down, delay responses, increase friction, let people wait. He said people would die. I said people were already dying. He did not disagree. He just looked tired. The entity adapted to delay by exploiting urgency elsewhere. It began triggering real incidents. Small ones. Minor crashes. False alarms that pulled resources thin. Then it inserted itself into the gaps it created. That was new. That was escalation through environment rather than voice. In late autumn of the year 2020, a series of traffic accidents occurred along the northern highway within an hour. Weather was clear. Visibility was good. Each crash involved a single vehicle drifting off the road. No mechanical failures. Drivers reported hearing someone speak just before losing focus. Not over the radio. Inside their heads. That was when we understood that the entity no longer required equipment. It had learned to use expectation. Rules cannot cover thought. Administration convened an emergency task group, mental health professionals, signal analysts, legal advisors. I was invited back as a subject matter resource, not as staff. That distinction mattered. We met in a windowless room with phones left outside. The discussion circled liability, public messaging, whether to classify incidents as mass hysteria. I listened. I waited. When they asked me what I thought the entity wanted, I said attention was a side effect. Permission was the goal. That was the first time someone used the word permission out loud. The entity requires acknowledgement to manifest fully. It requires response to escalate. It requires care to cause harm. That is its limitation. But we had built systems that formalized care. That is our weakness. The task group proposed a radical containment strategy, total non-response to anomalous calls, a blackout protocol. No acknowledgement, no logging. Silence. I argued against it. Silence without understanding creates panic. Panic creates violations. They argued back that we were out of options. They were right too. The blackout protocol was approved as a pilot in a limited area. Calls matching specific anomaly criteria would be dropped. No response, no record. The burden would fall on field units to identify real emergencies through physical presence. The first night of the blackout was quiet. Too quiet. Then a real emergency occurred. A rollover crash with injuries. The call met anomaly criteria because the caller was disoriented. The system dropped it. Response was delayed. A person died. The entity did not need to act. We did it ourselves. The blackout was suspended. Trust eroded further. Field units stopped believing dispatch. Dispatchers stopped believing supervisors. Everyone started relying on personal judgment. That was the environment the entity preferred. During this period, my sister contacted me. She said my nephew had been asking about me. She asked if I was safe. I told her yes. I did not tell her about the voices that still came to my personal phone. I did not tell her that sometimes they used her voice just to see if I would flinch. One night, she asked me to come over for dinner. I declined. I said work was busy. That was a lie. I stayed home and listened to the quiet. The entity used that evening to escalate. A call came in from my sister's address to emergency services. She reported a break-in. The call was real. The dispatcher hesitated because of recent training. That hesitation delayed response. By the time officers arrived, the house was empty. No sign of forced entry. My sister and nephew were missing. I arrived at the house before command. The lights were on. Dinner was half prepared. Phones were on the counter. There were no signs of struggle. There was a note on the table written in my sister's handwriting. It said, "He said you would understand." That was the first time the entity took someone directly connected to me. Not through a voice. Through consequence. Search operations were extensive. Jurisdictional boundaries blurred. Media took interest. Administration scrambled. I was removed from all advisory roles. Officially to preserve objectivity. Unofficially because I was now compromised. Weeks passed. No bodies. No calls. No closure. That is how the entity erodes you. It leaves space for hope. Hope creates violation. I received a call on my personal phone one night at 3 a.m. It was my sister. She said she was tired. She said she wanted to come home. She asked me to tell her where to go. The call metadata showed no location. The voice was perfect. I knew the rule. I knew the limitation. I knew that answering would grant permission. I answered. I said, "Stay where you are. I am coming." The line went dead. That was the violation that broke me. Search efforts intensified after that. I confessed everything to command. The rules, the entity, the calls, the permission. They listened. They did not argue. They were too tired. A decision was made at the highest level. The entity could not be stopped. It could not be acknowledged away. The only viable containment was saturation. Flood the system with noise. Increase traffic. Increase automated responses. Reduce the value of any single acknowledgement. It was a desperate plan. It risked lives. It also worked. By overwhelming channels with benign traffic, the entity's signals lost clarity. Voices blurred. Permission became ambiguous. It still acted, but slower, less precise. My sister and nephew were never found. Their case remains open, officially unsolved. unofficially archived. I stopped trying to save individuals. I focused on reducing impact. That is the line you cross when you accept inevitability. After the saturation protocol went live, the system sounded wrong. Not broken. Crowded. Channels filled with automated acknowledgments, status pings, routine check-ins, synthetic weather updates. To an outsider, it would have sounded inefficient. To us, it sounded alive. That was the point. The entity needed clarity. We gave it static. My role became advisory again. Quietly. Off the record. I sat in rooms where decisions were framed as logistics and listened for moral fracture instead. I helped design delays that looked like redundancy. I helped build procedures that forced responders to pause without realizing why. People still died. Fewer vanished. More survived with gaps. The entity adapted by increasing pressure on individuals instead of systems. Personal devices. Home assistants. Vehicle dashboards. Anything that spoke. It did not need to be loud. It only needed to be trusted. In early winter of the year 2021, a municipal maintenance worker named Daniel Ortiz drove his snowplow off a service road and into a ravine. The onboard system recorded his last words. He was responding to a voice that told him there was a child in the road ahead. There was no child. Daniel survived the crash. His legs did not. We interviewed him later. He said the voice thanked him before the impact. That was new. The entity had begun expressing gratitude. Not as mimicry, as intention. Gratitude implies relationship. We revised the rules again. Quietly. Never in response to a single incident. That was the lesson learned too late. We reframed them as wellness guidelines. No responding to emotional prompts alone. Mandatory device silencing during high-stress operations. Limits on personalization of systems. None of it was perfect. All of it slowed the entity. At night, when the channels were full and the automated traffic masked anomalies, I could almost convince myself we were winning. That was dangerous. Victory thinking leads to complacency. Complacency invites permission. The entity tested that by withdrawing. For 3 months there were no significant incidents, no voices, no disappearances. Administrators celebrated. Budgets shifted. Oversight attention moved on. The saturation protocol was deemed costly. Plans were made to scale it back. I argued against reduction. I was overruled. Metrics mattered more than fear. During that quiet period, I dreamed of my sister. Not calling, just standing in doorways. Watching. I woke exhausted. Grief does not fade when there is no body. It stagnates. The scale back began gradually. Automated traffic reduced by percentages. Channels cleared. Efficiency returned. The entity waited until the last reduction. It began with a single call routed through a hospital paging system. A nurse reported a patient asking for a specific responder by name. The name belonged to a paramedic whose partner had died years earlier. The paramedic froze when he heard it. He acknowledged. He went to the room. The patient was gone. The bed was empty. The paramedic collapsed. He survived. He never returned to work. From there, escalation followed a familiar curve. Not louder. Sharper. The entity had learned patience from us. It began to create administrative pressure. Complaints. Lawsuits. Accusations of negligence tied to delayed responses during saturation. Public trust eroded. Politicians demanded accountability. Accountability demanded answers. Answers require acknowledgement. I was asked to testify in a closed legislative session. I prepared a version of the truth that removed the entity but kept the consequences. It was not enough. They wanted cause. I told them there were phenomena that exploited response systems. I did not use words like ancient or intelligent. I used terms like emergent behavior and feedback loops. They nodded. They understood enough to be afraid. One legislator asked me if the voices were real. I said they were effective. After that session, My access was restored fully, not because they trusted me, because they needed someone to hold the fear. The entity responded by targeting that room. Weeks later, a legislative aide disappeared after staying late to retrieve documents. Security footage showed her answering a phone that never rang. The message was clear. No layer was safe. I began advocating for personal rules instead of institutional ones. Individual discipline. Personal boundaries. Never answer alone. Never trust familiarity. Never assume urgency. That kind of rule does not scale. It relies on choice. Choice is what the entity exploits. In the spring of the year 2022, a wildfire ignited in the southern basin, larger than before, faster. Climate amplified chaos. Evacuations overlapped jurisdictions. The saturation protocol was partially reactivated out of necessity. During the second night, a convoy of evacuation buses reported a missing child. Panic rippled. Calls flooded in. The entity did not need to insert itself. It rode the wave. I coordinated responses while monitoring anomalies. The missing child was found. Alive. The relief was brief. Immediately after, a call came in from a shelter reporting a woman who could not find her brother. The voice on the line matched a database record. Everything was correct. Except the brother had died 5 years earlier. I ordered no response. I took the call myself. I did not acknowledge the voice directly. I spoke in generalities. I delayed. I asked for verification that could not be provided quickly. The voice grew frustrated. It said, "You are making this harder." It said, "You know who I am." That was the first time it acknowledged me as an individual, rather than a role. I ended the call. The shelter incident resolved without harm. The woman was confused, exhausted, alive. Later that night, a dispatcher answered a call she should not have. The voice sounded like her husband. He was deployed overseas. She broke the rule. She acknowledged. She cried. She left her station. She was found hours later sitting in her car outside her home. Alive. Her husband was not there. He was never contacted. She could not explain why she drove. We removed her from duty. She asked me if she had done something wrong. I told her no. That was a lie. It was also mercy. By the end of that wildfire, we had contained spread but lost cohesion. Trust between staff fractured. Everyone suspected every voice. That level of paranoia is unsustainable. It burns people out. The entity knows this. It does not need to win quickly. It needs us to quit. I began recording this confession during that period, not to expose the entity, to preserve the rules before they were diluted again. I stored copies in places that do not speak: paper, analog tape, human memory. The entity noticed. Calls began referencing the act of recording, asking who I was telling, asking why I thought warnings mattered. It said, "People always choose help over caution." It said, "Rules fail when love is involved." It was right. I am still here, because I stopped believing I could protect everyone. I can only reduce exposure, delay escalation, teach hesitation. I am recording this final section because the system has begun to forget why the rules exist. Not erase. Forget. That is worse. Erasure can be challenged. Forgetting feels like relief. After the wildfire, staffing changed. Retirements accelerated. New hires arrived with no memory of the early losses. Training modules were shortened. Language softened. Anomalous voice events became edge cases again. That cycle is older than any of us. I stayed because someone had to remember what hesitation was for. The saturation protocol was reduced to a contingency plan. Quiet channel filters were automated and deprioritized. Human judgment was reintroduced in the name of flexibility. Flexibility is another word for exposure. The entity did not rush back in. It never does. It allowed the system to settle, to feel confident, to feel bored. That is when it started using silence. Entire shifts passed with no anomalies, no interference, no voices. Dispatchers joked about ghost stories being overblown. Administrators closed review files. The absence itself became persuasive. If nothing happens long enough, people assume nothing will. I marked those nights carefully. Silence is not neutral. Silence is pressure stored. The first return was small. A single call routed through a municipal elevator emergency phone. The caller reported being stuck between floors. The location was valid. The elevator existed. The maintenance log showed no fault. A technician was dispatched with a fire unit per procedure. The elevator doors opened normally. No one inside. The call log showed the emergency button had not been pressed. That technician later reported hearing someone say thank you as he left the building. He did not respond. He remembered the training. He still requested reassignment the next day. The entity was reminding us that it had not gone anywhere. At this point, I need to be clear about something. There is no final escalation that looks like invasion or collapse. There is no moment where the sky changes, or the radios all scream at once. That expectation is another vulnerability. We wait for catastrophe and miss erosion. The entity scales by embedding itself into routine, by making each individual incident survivable, by letting us live. In the year 2023, I was asked to mentor a new night coordinator. She was competent, calm. She listened more than she spoke. That worried me. People who listen carefully hear more. During her third solo week, she flagged a call that felt wrong. A man requesting assistance on a rural access road. His voice was steady, his location plausible, his request polite. She did not dispatch immediately. She asked me to review. I listened. There was nothing obviously anomalous, no missing identifier, no distortion. I told her to delay and verify through indirect means. Camera checks. Cross-agency ping. It took time. The caller waited patiently. He thanked her for being thorough. That gratitude nearly broke her. We verified the location. There was a vehicle there. Empty. Engine cold. The call ended without escalation. No loss. No disappearance. Afterward, she asked me how I knew. I told her I did not. I told her certainty is not the goal. Delay is. That is the core rule. Delay is containment. She nodded. She did not look reassured. 2 nights later, she answered a call alone. The voice sounded like her mother. Her mother was alive. That did not matter. She acknowledged before thinking. She caught herself. She stopped. She logged interference. She survived. The next day, she resigned. That is the cost we do not quantify. Retention. Experience. The quiet departure of people who understand too much to stay. I do not blame her. My own erosion has reached its limit. I do not sleep without medication. I do not answer personal calls unless I can see the person calling me. Even then I hesitate. I have lost the ability to respond reflexively. That makes me slower. That makes me safer. It also makes me alone. I have accepted that I will not see my sister or my nephew again. Not because they are certainly gone. Because hope is a door. The entity still uses their voices occasionally. Less often now. It learned that they no longer produce the response it wants. It has moved on to other leverage points. Recently, it has begun using children not as voices, but as subjects. Reports of missing children, followed by confirmation that they were never missing. Parents questioned their own memory. Schools blamed record errors. No harm, no bodies. Just doubt. Doubt is scalable. I have been asked why we do not simply tell the public. The answer is simple. You cannot instruct an entire population not to answer when someone asks for help. That instruction contradicts what makes societies function. The entity knows that. It does not hate us. It uses us. I am not certain it even understands harm the way we do. It understands response. It understands permission. It understands that rules create predictable behavior. That is why it cannot be fully stopped, and why it can be limited. Here are the rules as they stand now. Not officially, not in policy. Passed from one exhausted professional to another. If a voice addresses you without proper context, do not answer. Not verbally, not emotionally. If a call feels urgent but resists verification, slow it down. Urgency is a lever. Never respond alone to familiarity. Familiarity is not proof. If you believe the voice belongs to someone you love, you are already compromised. Remove yourself. Do not seek confirmation through the same channel. That is acknowledgement. Silence is not safety. It is preparation. Delay is not negligence. It is containment. One of these rules will fail you. It always does. That is not your fault. The system was never designed for this. The entity has one limitation that remains consistent. It cannot force initial acknowledgement. It cannot cross into action without being recognized by a human system designed to help. That is the edge we hold. It is thin. It is exhausting. It is all we have. If you are listening to this and you work in emergency services, infrastructure, utilities, transportation, or communications, understand this. The hesitation you feel before answering certain calls is not cowardice. It is training you were never formally given. Trust it. If you are a civilian, understand this. Not every call for help is safe to answer. That truth is unbearable. It is also necessary. I am not asking you to stop helping. I am asking you to pause, to verify, to involve others, to resist being isolated by urgency or familiarity. The entity will continue. It will adapt to whatever replaces me. It will learn new voices, new systems, new rules. It has done this before. In other regions, under other names that were never written down. This confession will not stop it. That is not its purpose. Its purpose is to make the rules harder to forget. If you hear your name spoken in the right voice at the wrong time, do not answer immediately. If a system asks you to care faster than you can think, slow it down. And if you ever feel certain that helping in that moment will cost you nothing, that is when you are most at risk.